sounds.
Latest, not last class. I had a last class in 2016.
That when you
Last
retired,
Yeah.
I was teasing Marley yesterday. I go, Marley, I don't understand what retirement means. You and Marie.
Well, I'll tell you what it means. It means life is more spacious. And I've noticed a difference when I've been coming back here.
Yeah.
Because all the stuff that would fill my day now gets squeezed around being here, eh?
Well, that's what he said too. He says the stuff I used to do like this. Now I do it a day or two. Or
Oh, yeah. All the stuff you used to do on a Saturday, squeeze into a Saturday, now it takes all week.
yeah.
All right, you lucky people. You get my undivided attention. Which means you can't fall asleep. Here's a book I'm gonna show. Are you going out to Haida?
Yeah.
You guys going?
Yeah, they both are.
Yeah. This is a great book about various things, but it includes the history of logging and lumbering and on Haida.
Oh, cool.
It's great. The Haida were like the Vikings. Did I tell you that? On the West Coast. They were the ones that went up and down the West Coast sort of terrorizing everybody.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, they were heavy duty dudes.
Oh. Yeah, we're just booking activities and ones. What is nettle? Do you know? Is it a plant? We're going to watch them. We're gonna go watch them harvest a nettle. I thought it was fish, but Dan thinks it's a plant.
No, it's a plant.
Okay.
Anyway, they don't have it's a beautiful place. And Dad said you've got an overnight Zodiac.
Well, no, he's trying to. There's some kind of day trip. He's
Yeah, I've been on that.
budget. He's trying to. I think he can. It's like $500 a person. So
Oh yeah.
I think we're gonna do it. Sounds fun.
How's the fundraising thing?
I think that
Were you guys involved in raising funds?
Tried.
Yeah, selling tickets, Laz?
well, you're in the bathroom, and the tickets only really went to Vivilik, so
If you're looking for that.
Thank you very
we
much.
made our videos.
Hi, live students.
Because the tickets were just common.
Oh, yes.
It was only Vivilik, but sweater is fun. Pretty good.
I got a lot.
Lydia made one of the newest design for the sweater, not this one, but the sweaters. This is the school one, but
Okay.
the narwhal one.
Oh, yeah.
That's Lydia's.
What's the most fun stuff you've done here? Oh, yeah. I mean, fun stuff, really enjoyable activities.
The trampoline, the human trampoline.
Oh, yeah.
That
yeah,
was my favorite.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, all right. Eh? When did you do that? Did you do that in Montreal? You take that with you?
We did that in Montreal, but the first time was in début March,
Oh, yeah.
the beginning, and it was still snowy.
Right.
And that day was a very hard day for students, and it was very slow. And at the end of the day, Dan pulled out the bucket of the trampoline, and it was so fun. It was moral booster.
Yeah.
I don't know the name in English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's it, a morale boost. And might have improved the morals too, who knows? And, all right, here's what I'm gonna bring the course to an end, and it's the chronology. Here's the stages, here's the structure to use to tell the story. You know, first off, it's about where the government was coming from before they even met you guys at a negotiation table. They had a long history dealing with Indians, First Nations, and and signing treaties that they had to do supposedly because of the Royal Proclamation, 1763, which said that people who were already on the land actually had legal rights to it, and whites couldn't go on that land and use it for themselves without an agreement with those people. And only the government could make those agreements, not people individually buying land or whatever. So that's the legal reason why the government ended up signing a lot of treaties all the way across as whites started settling from the East Coast to the West Coast. And then they stopped. 1923 was the last treaty, and they just forgot about it. Didn't feel they had to do it anymore. And First Nations were so marginalized that they weren't players in the political world at all, and could easily be forgotten. So the government just got out of the business of signing treaties, even though their lands were being occupied and populated by newcomers. That was in 1923, the last one. So there was a 50-year gap. And then there was the discovery of all that oil in Alaska in 1968. And that led to an invasion, literally an invasion of southern industry up into the Arctic regions, especially in the west around the Beaufort Sea, but also in the high Arctic and Hudson Bay, exploration in there, those places too, Lancaster Sound. And the problem was nobody was talking to the people in the north about, what do you think about this? Land was being disrupted, wildlife was being disrupted, and people's lives were threatened because of the potential loss of wildlife that they depended on. So the Inuit movement began. Tagai did that work to pull people together and create an organization that could at least speak on behalf of Inuit from across the north. So, and try and get the government to listen, get the government's attention, get public support, public awareness, and just establish yourselves as political players in Canada, try and influence the government. So those first 3 years, 69 to 73, that's what was going on at the beginning of the Inuit movement. But it was also a time when the government didn't feel it had to actually listen to you. You guys had no power as far as the government was concerned, and no legal rights at all, unless they decided you had any, and they weren't about to do that. And so the government in those days thought it held all the cards. I should be recording this audio.
Can they do our audio too?
At least if the video doesn't work. There'll be some record of that I was here to justify my fee. Okay. All right, what's the date today? April
21.
21. Tomorrow's the 22nd.
Hey, that's how they talk in Jamaican. So.
So this is the last class in IGR, and we're just going to ultimately go through what happened after the Nunavut claim was signed in 1993. But just reviewing for the moment where we've come, talking about the historical background in terms of where government was coming from, and we're just talking about the period 1969 to 73, which was involving where the government was trying to get the government to listen to you guys. You guys are standing up politically and trying to. Hi, my name. We're just on our way, and getting the government to listen, get their attention, but at that point, the government did not feel it had to recognize anything in the way of rights. They could talk to you if they wanted to, but they didn't. That changed in 1973 when that Supreme Court decision came down, led by the Nisga'a, the First Nations in British Columbia. And the Supreme Court surprised the federal government totally. They never saw it coming. The court actually said, wait a minute, people who have not signed a treaty and surrendered any of their rights still have them. Well, shock, shock, shock. And so that meant the government could no longer assume it held all the cards, because people had an Aboriginal right that wasn't clarified. They could go to court and get the judge to say, tell the government that this means we're the boss, we own this land, we can put a fence around it if we want and stop anybody from coming onto it. That's the extreme version of what it could have meant, but nobody knew what it meant, just that you guys still had right. The government couldn't get around you, couldn't pretend you didn't anymore. So it had to sort this out. And
Right. What level of court did they have to go to for this? Did it start just BC court, or did it go all the way to the federal court?
This, for the Niska decision?
Yeah,
Yeah, they went to the BC Supreme Court first, then they appealed, they lost. They appealed it to the BC Court of Appeal,
Mhm.
they lost. And then they went to the Supreme Court. So it was a high risk decision to go to all the way, because if they'd lost at the Supreme Court, no government would talk to them.
yeah, it would
ever
have
again.
affected every province.
Yeah, there was nowhere else to go. So, so the rest of this decade was spent starting to negotiate, but not going anywhere. The government brought out a policy in 73, about 6 months after the Niska decision, saying, okay, we should sit down and sort this out together like adults. And we're willing to negotiate a land claim settlement with you guys. And here's what it's going to contain. And it's a very limited number of things. They were willing to give you little bits of land and all that territory you said was yours. They're willing to let you keep hunting and fishing and doing those kind of things, because nobody in the South was going up north to do those things. So what did it matter? And they were willing to lay a lot of money on the table. We saw it already. Well, it's quickly after, when the James Bay Cree and Northern Quebec Inuit settled. The total was $225 million. And people in Quebec at the time freaked out about that. The public was outraged that that amount of money was being given to a bunch of native people up north, and it's like they all won the lottery. It was unbelievable to people in the South that much. But anyway, that's how badly the government wanted you guys to sign it, a land claims agreement. But money doesn't last. You spend it, the money's gone. Your machine's nice and new for a few years, breaks down. What do you got left? So money alone was not what people were after. And in fact, the slogan of the day was, "This land is not for sale." And people didn't want to come out of a land claim settlement with the government still having all the power and Inuit having none. That was not the point of the exercise. So they spent those years, 6 years, only each side put out its non-negotiable, the thing that it wasn't willing to bend on. Your side came up with the vision, we want a territory of our own, where we're the majority, we run it. And we'll call it Nunavut. Government wasn't interested in the least in going. The government wanted you guys to sign off that you have no more Aboriginal rights to your land. And your position was, we're not going to do that. You can't do that. That hurts too much to think of that. So nothing moved, no negotiations. Then the logjam got broken. In 1979, there was a big meeting in Igloolik, Inuit leadership, people from all the communities. And they came up with a strategy to break the deadlock. Because the government was continuing to issue exploration permits galore. So the pressure from development was still on. There was the expectation of major pipeline projects happening at any time. So that's why the Inuvialuit separated themselves from the Nunavut claim, because they were on the front lines of all that pressure, and they had to sort out where they stood with all those things. On the issue from the Central and Eastern Arctic, there was less pressure. Your leadership could take more time and just hang in until they got more of what they wanted. So in that meeting in 79 in Igloolik, the Inuit leadership made a number of key decisions. They said, first, they'll pull off the whole issue of creating an Inuit territory away from land claims negotiations. And that freed up, so it wasn't a block. It wasn't a blocking the government from talking about other things. Let's see what else we can talk about, and then we'll come back to that issue at the end rather than trying to sort it out at the beginning. And also, the government agreed to put off the whole issue of extinguishment until the end as well. Didn't take them off the table, just said, let's put them aside. We'll talk about everything we can talk about and agree on, and then we'll deal with those later. And both sides thought the other side at the end of the day was going to give in. on extinguishment or creating Nunavut. So they spent the next 10 years negotiating the whole claim, everything that's in here. And it took 10 years. And that's where they pushed for a sharing of decision-making around the management of land and resources, negotiated all those provisions. This is what we're gonna do this, but this is where they split. Separated land claims negotiations, what's in here from creating a Nunavut territory. So there's talks were happening in two different places, but at the same time. And here's the pieces of the contents of the land claims agreement. But at the end of the day, your leaders said at the very outset of proposing this split, the separation of talks, they said, you have to understand that whatever we agree to in land claims at the end of this day, we're not signing it unless the government does what we want with creating that territory, dividing the Northwest Territories. The government's response always was, we note your position. In other words, we're not saying yes or no to what you're asking for. We're reserving our opinion till the time comes. But they thought, once you guys saw all of you were getting in the land claims, you would bend and buckle and not continue to insist that you get what you wanted with the territory. So those are two issues that ended up still at the very end of the whole process. Would you guys sign off your Aboriginal rights to the land as the price to pay for your land claims agreement? And second, would the government of Canada be willing to divide the Northwest Territories and create a territory where you guys are in the majority? And then there was different events during negotiating. There were plebiscites, there was a fight over the boundary, et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm just going to get into the new stuff now, and I'm just going to give you exposure to what the main events and elements were after the land claims was signed, because the government did cave in on Nunavut, and in the last hour, middle of the night, up in Parliament Hill, that story you've heard me say, the government said yes. They wanted an agreement so bad at the very end that they were willing to say yes to dividing the Northwest Territories. That was the last piece of the puzzle. And if they hadn't signed that, all the other pieces would have been blown away. Your side would have walked away from everything they'd negotiated. That's how strong their convictions were on that one. So there was a process. Yeah, in the land claims, Article 4, it's the smallest article, only half a page, but it's the most important one in some respects, because this is the last thing that got negotiated on that night up on Parliament Hill, where the government said, the government of Canada will recommend to Parliament as a government measure, meaning the government sponsoring it, legislation to establish within a defined time period a new Nunavut territory with its own legislative assembly and public government, separate from the government of the remainder of the Northwest Territories. And so that's what they got. And and even in that last meeting up on Parliament Hill, the government right to the last minute was tried to say, well, we'll put in something that says we're going to keep talking about the idea and we'll work towards it and make a decision later about creating Nunavut. And your leader said, no, you won't. You either say you're going to do it now or we're walking. And you're not getting an agreement, because they needed one because the Prime Minister wanted it. So only half a page, but it's worth everything else in the whole agreement. And one of the things that they did, they allowed, this was in 1993 when this was signed into law, and they built into it when they passed it through Parliament, gave it 6 years, a 6-year time period to do a number of things. They created a Nunavut Implementation Commission, basically to design what the new government, how the new government would work, where it would be, what it would look like. This was a chance to create a whole new government. What would it be like? Some interesting issues came to the fore. The mandate was to design a new government. Here's some of the people that were on the commission. There were 9 of them. You'll recognize, guess who? John McGually. John was at the forefront of every key initiative since he got hired in 1975, whether it was the land claims negotiations, constitutional stuff, broadcasting, getting IBC started, and now creation of Nunavut. He was president of ITC for a number of years in the 80s as well. Mika Killebuk, that's Lynn's mother. Very strong, very prominent person. Peter, has Peter been in? Peter?
No, not this year.
Okay. And Mary Simon. Where?
It's not on.
No, I didn't. Funny, I didn't type her name in, but she was on there for some reason too, in that, even though she wasn't from Nunavut. And so they were given 6 years to answer a lot of questions about how do you divide one government into 2 governments? Which goes with what? And what gets transferred from Yellowknife and what stays in Yellowknife for the NWT? And staffing and all these administrative aspects. How many departments there will be in the government? What do they be called? A whole bunch of organizational questions had to be sorted out before the territory was actually ready to go. So that's what happened during the 90s, 93 to 99. They had a plebiscite. Plebiscite is just it's not an election because nobody's running for and against. There's no people involved. It's more on a plebiscite is an official opinion poll launched by the government to hear what people want to do on a certain question. And one of the questions was, where should the capital of the new Nunavut territory be? And the Implementation Commission ended up putting forth two options, Rankin and Iqaluit. So this was the vote. This was 1995. These are the things that had to be sorted out. So 60% voted in favor of Iqaluit. You know, the population in Baffin was heavier than the other regions, so it's not a big surprise. And so that's one choice that had to be made. Another one was there was another plebiscite on. They were designing the legislature. How many MLAs should there be? That was an open question, right? But they had to make a very interesting decision and choice on that question. It's should the legislature be forced to have an equal number of men and women? I want to give you a ballot. I want to see how you vote. I'll explain what the issue was, how they were going to do it.
And Mary Simons?
What's that?
And Mary Simons was.
Yeah, Mary Simon was on it too. I'll explain how they were going to do it, and then you can mark your ballot yes or no, fold it up, and I'll pass the hat and we'll collect them. But here's what they were wanting to do. Here's what the commission proposed to the people of what was going to be Nunavut, all the Nunavut community. You know, the standard way where political elections are held, politicians are elected, you have one riding and a bunch of people put their names forward and the one with the most votes wins, right? We all know about that. That's easy. But they proposed something different. And it was the first time in the world that it had ever been proposed as a way of electing people. They said, what if we have half the number of ridings? So instead of 22 ridings, there'd be 11. But in every riding, there would be 2 lists of people that somebody would be chosen from both lists. One list would be for men candidates, and one list would be for women candidates. So guaranteed, there would be a man and a woman elected from every riding. Good or not good? Mark your ballots.
Yes or no?
Yes or no? Do you think it would be a reasonable, appropriate thing to do? A good idea, or to guarantee that there's both a man and a woman, equal number of MLAs, male and female. It was a very novel idea. Y or N? Hold the ballots? Don't sign them. I don't even have my hat. All right. That's great. All right. So would it be good, if you guys were in charge, what would the outcome be? A good idea to have equal number of men and women guaranteed? 1 for yes. 2 for yes. How many have we got? 3? 6. No, 1 for no. 1 for yes. 1 for yes. 1 for yes. All right, who said no? Well, that's interesting, hey? You want to share any reason, Nikki, for why you felt no?
I felt no because if it doesn't matter like who's in power, who's the person that's in power, any sex that that person may have. For me personally, is the ideas, and if the person is like able to do the job, able to have good ideas for whom that is majority, it is what it is. If it's a girl or a boy, I don't really care about it because I like for political stuff and the decision making, I don't feel that sex is a big priority. Is mostly is what's gonna happen in the future, what's gonna happen, what are the ideas, and if it's good for the person involved, kind of.
Yeah. Okay, sounds fair. What do you guys think? How come you voted yes? Why? Yeah. What difference would it make to have women and men both in the legislature?
I feel like politics is like a very men-dominated force.
Yeah.
Especially in the past, and I feel like there should be more women able to talk about the issues that they have, because I feel like men and women have the same issues but are affected very differently.
Oh, yeah,
So I feel like women should also have a voice
Yeah.
regarding things
Yeah,
that
yeah.
they're being affected by.
Yeah, okay, cool. What do you think? Why would it be positive to have equal number of women? What made the difference for you?
Just for like making sure that there's women in the workplace, because like just to make sure that women are still getting like jobs and being able to have position and power and being able to make decisions, because it's not only men but it's not only men but it's there. So I think having women there is like an important thing, because I don't know,
Yeah,
it's not only men that can make decisions.
really? You're no kidding. Yes, you're right. I agree.
That's a novel idea. But it
Oh,
didn't
no,
go through, eh?
and how about you guys? How come you voted yes? What difference? Why would it be better to have equal number of women in the government? You don't know. But it feels good. What do you think? Why would you think it would make a positive difference?
Women should be involved too,
Mhm.
not only men. And so that they can both be treated equally.
Yeah. It was a very interesting public debate. And the result was this. Oh, yeah, that's just a description of how they would be chosen. 43% said yes, 57 said no. And guess what? The no vote was led by a woman. Yeah. Manita Thompson,
Oh, Leanne Smith.
and she was an MLA in the NWT legislature at the time. Very strong person, very vocal, and she argued very strongly publicly that women didn't need special rights to ensure they're elected. That they could compete on their own terms anytime they wanted and still beat men if they were interested in doing it. So, and the irony is, all the male leadership in the Inuit organizations was for the yes. So it wasn't what you would have expected. And
I kind of did.
Huh?
I kind of did. I was expecting that most men would say this.
yeah. Oh,
Is this argument over the agenda?
no,
Was that early?
no, that was earlier. This is implementing this is the creation of Nunavut from 93 to 99. Just some of the things that happened in order to prepare for the new government to start. But now let me switch over to, that's about the creation of Nunavut, getting the territory off the ground. Let me go back up to 93 and highlight the story of the implementation of the land claims agreement, not Nunavut territory stuff, but the land claims stuff. And because there's a much longer story. Well, it's an ongoing story, obviously. Here's a graph that shows you the timeline, and I'll speak to. Well, let me. I put James Bay in there because in some ways it had an influence on what happened in terms of the implementation of your land claim. I mentioned this in passing when we covered the James Bay land claims, but it was the first modern land claim settlement that governments had undertaken since 1923. So it's 52 years a gap where there was nobody in government doing that kind of stuff. So they were new at it as well. And the negotiated agreement, the Nunavik agreement was more with the provincial government of Quebec. The Cree negotiations were with the federal government because they were status Indians, and your negotiators had the benefit of their bad experience. They provided a real learning opportunity for people that were negotiating their claims afterwards. Because once they got here it is right here. Both land claims are in this book, James Bay and Northern Quebec agreements. Once this was signed and the government got the signatures extinguishing people's rights to their land, like is what they wanted out of any treaty, Ottawa just walked away. This book is half full of obligations to the James Bay Cree. And the government people in the federal government, after getting this signed, they came back to Ottawa and they didn't put anything in place to follow through in any of their obligations. They didn't put anything in place, no bureaucracy established, people or anything like that to make sure they were going to do what they said. And it caused a big scandal when the Cree, raised a lot of hell about it by the early 80s. Anyway, your negotiators were very aware of that experience. And so one of the things they did that hadn't been done before, in the last year before the agreement was signed, 1992, they had one of their lawyers meet for a year with federal government lawyers. And they went through this book, clause by clause, the land claims book, and they negotiated a contract. And every clause in here, it's the implementation contract. And it's actually, I think it's thicker than the land claims agreement, because every single clause they broke apart and they nailed down, okay, what's gonna happen on this clause? Who's gonna do it? When, who's involved, which departments, which governments, which organizations? What are the actual activities that are gonna be undertaken to do it, and who's gonna pay for it? They couldn't have nailed down the tent any more than that. And all for the purpose of avoiding what happened with the Cree. They made sure the government had a legal obligation to take very specific steps on every part of the land claims agreement. And as I say, it took most of a year to negotiate this. This before the final land claims was signed. And so here's the timeline. So there's your land claims signed in 93. And the thing is, this contract applied for 10 years. They had, and there was a commitment to have a different, an updated contract every 10 years. Forever. So there's continually holding their feet to the fire in an updated way. So this contract was from 1993 to 2003. In 2001, they started meeting about what should be in the next 10-year contract. These are 10-year periods. In 2001, they started meeting 2 years ahead of when this was up. Because, and this is where things went sideways and downhill. Because by that point, well, this first contract specified how much money was going to be given to the IPGs, for example, to operate. Water Board, Wildlife Management Board, because that the federal government had to pay for those. So this is where it was nailed down at the front end. But the first 10 years of their operation, they were learning how much they needed to really operate well. So when it came time to negotiate the next contract, a lot of the dispute ended up being how much the government was willing to pay to make those organizations work well. And the government wasn't willing to increase the funding. So there was a stalemate. And oh, I should mention, one of the things that's in this contract, yeah.
So like we have the, you know, about land claims agreement?
Yeah.
But then we also have a contract in place just to make sure that the government follows through with it, and that's when they talk about like.
Yeah.
Who needs to do what, how and how long it will take.
Yeah. It was smart for various reasons, one of which is you can always go to court saying that something contradicts your land claims agreement. That's always an option because it's got legal constitutional weight. But they paralleled it with a legal contract. There's contract law is part of a big part of ordinary law. So if you break your contract, you can be sued. So that's why they spelled out as much as possible what the government was going to have to do in as much detail. So there's all sorts of 1,000 hooks to hang your hat on. And one of the things this contract put in place is a commitment to do every 5 years to do a comprehensive review of how it's going. So that all sides would be able to see and be accountable for it. So the first one, again, another thick book. And again, they went through everything and they rated it as either is being partially met on an ongoing basis, or is not being met, or is being fully met. That was the criteria. And it was done by an independent company and just talked to everybody on all sides, went through how things are going, how well is it working, the actual things that had to be done. And this was a summation and an analysis of whether it was working or not, how much it was working. Some things had to be done only once. Some things were ongoing obligations. So, but thorough, trying to make sure there was no escape from their anybody's responsibilities. And it wasn't just about government's responsibilities, was about DIOs, designated Inuit organizations, et cetera. Everybody had responsibilities. So this was a way of monitoring it very, very closely. And so there were, in that decade, there were 2 of these. After 5 years and after the next 5 years. So, and that's an ongoing obligation forever. So they built in as much as they can to ensure accountability. Anyway, the talks broke down. Government wasn't budging because what they found out, I'll give you an example. In these first 10 years, they found out how much it cost for something like the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board to operate, how much it cost for their building, their facilities, how much for staff, and what the workload was. And so they came out of that first 10 years with an accurate measure of, okay, what's it going to take to make this work? And one of the areas was on funding the HTOs, because they were the main means by which Inuit would have input into wildlife management. Yes, they were the people out there on the land hunting, and they had the knowledge of what was out there. And but they were very underfunded. They might have a half-time person, and with not a lot of administrative support, whereas government departments who were also on the Wildlife Management Board, had whole departments full of scientists and biologists and whatever. So it was a really uneven. So one of the things that they wanted to do was correct that in the second contract. Government wouldn't go there. So that's the end of the first contract in 2003. And again, talks for the second contract weren't going anywhere. So 3 years later, NTI says, okay, boys, you don't want to sort of do things that are going to fulfill your obligations the way we think you should. We'll take you to court and sue you for $1 billion. They picked $1 billion just to get the government's attention. Talk big money, they pay attention. So they went to court and with a long list of ways that the government has not fulfilled its obligations, and under a whole bunch of the articles. A lot of them having to do with funding, a lot of them having to do with training. And so they went to court and sued it for $1 billion. It took 9 years to prepare their case before they went in front of a judge, to duke it out in front of a judge. 213, 215, just before, literally days before they were scheduled to be in front of a judge, to start finally putting the case to a judge, and they agreed to settle. The government agreed to settle out of court. Why? Here's how that works when somebody takes somebody else to court. You have to show, before you get in front of a judge, each side has to show the other side what they're going to tell the judge, what the evidence is they're going to use, what the arguments are they're going to make. So they spent almost a year doing that. David Kunuk was the NTI guy, and he was down here for almost a year, and he was grilled by government lawyers to find out what arguments they were going to make. This is not in front of a judge. This is just so government would know what their arguments would be. And same with NTI. They got to ask government people and to see what the government's arguments were going to be. So they each tested each other out before going in front of a judge. And what that meant was then their lawyer, once they heard what the other side had to say, or was going to have to say, they would make their own judgment on a particular issue. They would assess who's got the strongest case just between them. And the government lawyers ended up deciding that they're going to win this one over here on this, and this. We might win this one and this one, but they're going to win all these ones. And there's a whole long list of these points. So the government decided, instead of going to court and losing and being costing us $1 billion, they offered to settle for a cash. And in 2015, and I'll summarize some of the highlights of it. Not just cash, but other things. So it meant there was gonna be finally a new contract going to 2023. And it was gonna be backdated to 2013. So that's what they're in right now. And that's mainly the main part of that is some funding. Funding for HTOs, for example, went way up. And, but here's an overview of the main things that are in that settlement. I mean, they took 9 years to prepare for that case. That's how much information there was. Hundreds of thousands of documents they had to go through to recall what was said at the negotiating tables in the early 80s. So they got increased funding for IPGs from the government, a commitment in this current contract. And just to support them in doing the work that was needed. NTI itself got $85.5 million just for itself. Why? To cover its costs leading up to that case, and because they had lost money in the process by things not being implemented the way they were supposed to be in terms of funding. NTI got $175 million and to put towards training. Because one of the big cost items that caused NTI to go to court had to do with training. Article 23, a commitment that the government had made to increase the workforce in Nunavut, in the Nunavut government and the federal government, to represent the proportion of Inuit in the overall Nunavut population. So Inuit employment in the GN has always been around 50%. It actually went down in the first couple of years when Nunavut was started, and but it's depending on the level of staffing. It's never reached 80% at all. Never even been close to it. And NTI did major research to show and was able to show that if Inuit had been employed during those years up to the level of 80%, they would have earned X amount of hundreds of millions of dollars in salary. That would have been in Inuit pockets, Inuit hands. And that was lost because the government had not succeeded in achieving the goal of 82% or 84% Inuit employment. So NTI has created a Makigiakta Inuit Training Corporation. And with that money. And in addition to the money going to NTI, the federal government itself committed in the settlement to spend $50 million of its money on training in Nunavut, and that's divided between the GN and the feds, depending on who's doing the training and who's got the most Inuit employees, or the least Inuit employees, perhaps. And the last two things to highlight, there's a section in this Article 38 in the Land Claims Agreement. It's called arbitration. And what that means is, it's like going to a court without going to a court. If you've got a dispute that you can't resolve, between the two parties can't resolve, they can hire an arbitrator, somebody they both agree on, and they'll each make their case for why they should or shouldn't do something. And they agree in advance, we'll let that person decide for us. Because we need a decision, but we can't come to it ourselves. So we'll just hire somebody to be sort of like a private judge. And we do, when we agree to commit, we agree to do whatever that judge says. Well, in this, the Land Claims Agreement says both parties, the feds and NTI, have to agree to go to arbitration. NTI wanted to do that a number of times, a long list of times. The government will always say, no, we don't want to do that. So nothing could come of it. So this settlement means that either NTI or the feds can call for arbitration and the other side has to show up. And that's gonna be a big problem solver. Because government, that'll get around a government sort of option of just stalling and not getting any decision at all. And there's another area that involves a lot of money, and that is government procurement, it's called, which means government issuing contracts for all sorts of things, services, goods. government is the biggest spender in Nunavut, whether it's federal government or Nunavut government. They buy services, they build things. And the land claims was meant to, Article 24, about government contract, to give Inuit preferential support, Inuit-owned business to be treated favorably and compared to Southern businesses. So Inuit businesses can be supported, have access to all those opportunities. And the federal government, Nunavut government hasn't done a bad job, but the federal government was nowhere on that one. And so a ton of federal contracts, Inuit businesses never got a chance to bid on them. And that money was passing the Inuit businesses right by. So the settlement agreement firms that up. Has to be an effective policy. So Inuit businesses can tap into all that money that's being spent in Nunavut, but largely being paid to Southern companies. Huh.
Can you go back, please? I didn't-
Where are they currently negotiating the next contract, you know?
Yeah.
Since 2023.
It's they must be starting.
Thank you.
And anyway, the real lesson here is one that, they didn't just learn from the James Bay Cree experience. They learned from their own after 10 years that unless they push and always stay on the government's toes or on its back to ensure things are followed through with. Government, it's very convenient for government if people don't push them, they won't do something. And not true from top to bottom. And there's a level of commitment at various levels in different departments, but but the role of NTI is to be the entity that monitors. NTI has an implementation branch, and their sole job is to monitor how things are going on every front and be able to advise NTI whether it's working or not. So I was thinking this morning, if you guys at least even know that these things happened, you're up to speed with the current generation of leaders because they've lived through that. But you don't have to be expert in it, but to know that that's the story and what some of the lessons are from it, then that equips you to sort of be up to speed with people that are a lot older than you. And we're part of the story itself. And it's an ongoing story. So anybody that understands the implementation process and what the key documents have been, what the ups and downs have been, is that's really valuable knowledge to have when you're looking for work. Because everything in Nunavut dances in relation to this. It sets out the rules for everybody, businesses, governments, Inuit organizations, and so anybody that knows what's in here and is not afraid to open it up is a valuable employee. So I wish you well. What you end up doing. Yeah, I think it's my last class.